Imagine walking through a quiet European village in the year 1347. The sun sets, shadows stretch across the cobblestones, but instead of children playing or merchants shouting, the streets are eerily silent. Doors hang open. Dogs wander through. Abandoned homes. The air carries not the smell of food or firewood, but something darker, something rotting. Within weeks, this entire community will vanish, its people gone as if swallowed by the earth. And here is the terrifying truth. This was not just one village, this was Europe. A continent that within just a few short years lost 1 out of every 3 human beings to a disease so merciless, so unstoppable, that it reshaped the course of history forever. This was the Black Death. But how did it happen? Where did this horror come from? And why did it strike Europe with such ferocity? To answer that, we have to leave Europe behind and travel back to the heart of Asia, where the story begins. The Black Death was not born in Europe. It was an uninvited traveler, carried across continents by trade, war, and chance. Most historians trace its origins to the vast steppes of Central Asia in the early 14th century. Here, in the wide grasslands that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, small mammals like marmots and gerbils carried a deadly passenger, fleas infected with a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this bacterium had lurked in isolated animal populations, flaring up in small outbreaks. But in the 1300s, conditions aligned in a way that would let it escape its natural reservoirs and begin its journey toward infamy. Why then? Why there? The 14th century was an era of connection. The Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan, had created the largest land empire in human history, stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Along its vast highways of conquest and commerce, caravans moved silk, spices, silver, and slaves, and with them, something invisible hitched a ride. Trade routes like the Silk Road were the arteries of globalization long before the modern world. But they were also perfect highways for disease. What had once been an isolated killer among animals now found a superhighway into the bloodstream of human civilization. The first great outbreak that hinted at the scale of what was coming erupted in China. In the 1330s, plague swept through provinces, devastating towns and reportedly killing millions. Entire armies collapsed from sickness. Cities that had thrived for centuries emptied. Travelers and traders carried stories of the Great Pestilence westward, but in an age before modern science, these warnings sounded more like rumors than fact. By the time the disease reached the Black Sea, it had already left devastation in its wake. And this brings us to one of the most dramatic twists in the Black Death's early history, the Siege of Kaffa. In 1346, Mongol forces besieged the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, located in Crimea. The Mongols too were dying of the plague. Desperate, and in what may have been the first known act of biological warfare, they catapulted the corpses of their own plague-stricken soldiers over the city walls. Panic spread faster than arrows. The defenders fled, boarding ships bound for Mediterranean ports. But in their cargo holds and on their clothes, the plague came with them. Rats infested the ships. Fleas clung to rats, and when the ships docked, death came ashore. By 1347, the Black Death had arrived in Europe. Its first stop, Messina, a port city in Sicily. Eyewitnesses later described how ships drifted into the harbor, filled not with bustling sailors but with silence and stench. The few men still alive stumbled onto land, their bodies covered in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Within days, Sicily was ablaze with infection. Attempts to quarantine the sick failed miserably. The disease spread like fire through dry brush, leaping from Sicily to mainland Italy, from Italy to France, and from France across the heart of Europe. What exactly made this disease so terrifying? It wasn't just its lethality, though. That was horrifying enough. The plague killed between 50 and 70% of those it infected. Imagine an illness today with those odds. But worse than that was the speed. One day, a person might feel healthy. The next, a fever, chills, and vomiting would set in. Then came the buboes, swollen, blackened lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck, sometimes as large as an apple. They were agonizing, and they gave the disease its iconic name, the bubonic plague. In some cases, the infection spread to the lungs, turning into pneumonic plague, which could pass from person to person through coughing. In its septicemic form, it flooded the bloodstream and killed within hours. To contemporaries, it seemed as if the very air had turned poisonous. People described it as a miasma, a corruption of the atmosphere. The fear was indescribable. Cities tried everything to stop it. In Venice, the authorities introduced a 40-day isolation period for arriving ships, which gave us the word quarantine. Doctors dressed in long robes with beaked masks stuffed with herbs tried to ward off infection. Religious processions filled the streets, with flagellants whipping themselves in hopes that God's wrath would be appeased. But nothing worked. The death toll mounted. By 1348, the plague swept into France and Spain. England was struck in 1349. By 1350, it reached Scandinavia. By the early 1350s, no corner of Europe had been spared. Kings, nobles, peasants, priests, death did not discriminate. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, so many corpses were buried in the river Rhône that the water reportedly ran red. Chroniclers wrote of whole families dying together in their homes, of villages so emptied that wolves roamed freely through the countryside. But here's where the story becomes even more gripping. For all its horror, the plague did not affect everyone equally. Wealthier families sometimes managed to flee to the countryside, as famously depicted in Boccaccio's Decameron, where a group of Florentines escaped the pestilence by telling stories in a secluded villa. Yet even there, the disease often found them. Meanwhile, the poor had little chance of escape. Packed into tight urban quarters with little food and no medical knowledge, they died in staggering numbers. And still, the plague did more than kill. It shook the very foundations of European society. Priests fled their parishes, abandoning the sick. Doctors confessed their helplessness. Parents abandoned children. Neighbors refused to bury neighbors. A society built on bonds of faith and community suddenly fractured. If God was merciful, people asked, why had he unleashed such punishment? If the church was powerful, why could it not protect them? The Black Death was not just a biological disaster. It was a spiritual earthquake. By the end of the 1340s, Europe was no longer the same. Millions had died, perhaps 25 million in Europe alone, and maybe as many as 75 million worldwide. 1 out of every 3 Europeans was gone. To put that in perspective, imagine if 1 out of every 3 people you know, friends, family, co-workers, were suddenly erased. The silence left behind was deafening. Fields lay untilled, workshops closed, armies shrank. Even nature seemed to reclaim the land, with forests regrowing where farms had once stood. And yet this was not the end of the Black Death story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. For while the plague destroyed, it also transformed. It rewrote economies, toppled feudal systems, and set Europe on a path that would eventually lead to the modern world. But that transformation was not immediate, and it came at a terrible cost, because the worst was yet to come. By 1349, the plague did not just bring disease, it brought hatred. Whispers began to spread. Perhaps this was not a natural disaster at all. Perhaps someone had caused it. Across Europe, rumors accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells. These lies ignited violent pogroms, massacres that killed thousands of innocent people. Fear of death turned into fear of one's neighbor, and the plague unleashed a wave of human cruelty as devastating as the disease itself. So how did Europe survive? How did it crawl out of this abyss of suffering and begin to rebuild? And why, despite the horror, did the Black Death become one of the most transformative events in all of human history? What if I told you that Europe's greatest killer also became its greatest engine of change? That out of the mountains of corpses, the abandoned villages, and the shattered faith, something new emerged. Something that would eventually transform Europe into the birthplace of the modern world. It sounds almost impossible. How could a disease that erased 1/3 of an entire continent also plant the seeds of rebirth. Yet this is the strange and haunting legacy of the Black Death. By the early 1350s, the first great wave of the plague had burned its way across Europe, leaving devastation behind. People were broken, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Survivors lived with the trauma of watching loved ones die in agony. Entire towns vanish overnight, and institutions they had trusted collapse. It was not just the dead who were changed. It was the living. The Europe that emerged after the plague was not the same Europe that had existed before. Let's start with the most immediate and visible impact: the economy. Before the plague, Europe's economy was built on a feudal system. Vast estates owned by nobles relied on the labor of peasants who worked the land. Populations were large, food supplies were strained, and wages for common people were pitifully low. But after the plague, with a third of the population gone, everything changed. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers. Whole villages were left empty. Landowners found themselves desperate to attract labor. And peasants, for the first time in generations, had leverage. They could demand higher wages. They could move to new lands where conditions were better. In many places, laws were even passed to stop wages from rising. But such laws often failed. The balance of power between lord and peasant shifted. Feudalism, once the backbone of medieval society, began to crack under the weight of scarcity. Think about the irony. A disease that killed millions also gave new power to the survivors. With more land available and fewer mouths to feed, diets improved. People ate more meat, more dairy, and more grains. Standards of living for those who remained actually rose in many regions. For centuries, the poor had been trapped in cycles of poverty, but now the old system was weakening. It wasn't equality, but it was a step toward something closer to it. But economics was only the beginning. The Black Death also unleashed a profound spiritual crisis. For generations, the Catholic Church had been the central authority in Europe, not just in religion, but in politics, law, and even science. People turned to priests for answers to every great question of life and death. Yet during the plague, the Church faltered. Priests fled parishes, sacraments were abandoned, and prayers seemed to go unanswered. People wondered, if God truly ruled over the world, why had he unleashed such horror? If the Church was his voice, why had it failed to protect the faithful? This disillusionment had long shadows. In the short term, it led to bizarre extremes. Flagellants marching through towns, whipping themselves in search of forgiveness, or wild accusations that Jews or heretics had caused the plague. But in the long term, it eroded blind faith in the Church's absolute authority. A few centuries later, that doubt would explode into the Protestant Reformation, reshaping Christianity forever. And while the Reformation had many causes, the memory of the Black Death lingered as one of the sparks that made people question whether the Church truly held all the answers. Now let's talk about something you might not expect: culture. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture a world of castles, knights, and endless tradition. But after the Black Death, art, literature, and thought took a darker, more questioning turn. Death was no longer an abstract idea. It was everywhere, in every household, on every street. This obsession with mortality gave birth to haunting imagery: skeletons dancing with the living, skulls carved into tombs, paintings of corpses alongside kings. Known as the danse macabre, or dance of death, this imagery reminded people that no one, not the rich, not the powerful, not the holy, was safe from death's embrace. Writers captured the despair and the absurdity of life in plague-ridden Europe. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the aftermath of the Black Death, tells of 10 young Florentines who escaped the pestilence by retreating to a villa and telling each other stories. It's both an escape from horror and a reflection of it. Later, the shadow of the plague would echo in the works of writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and, centuries later, William Shakespeare. Even today, our fascination with apocalyptic stories can be traced back to the terror of those years. But here's the twist. While art obsessed over death, society was inching toward rebirth. The plague helped dismantle the rigid structures of the medieval world, and in the gaps something new began to emerge: the Renaissance. With populations smaller, opportunities opened for survivors. Talented individuals could rise more easily, unbound by the old hierarchies. Cities like Florence and Venice, devastated by plague yet enriched by trade, invested in art, science, and philosophy. The very conditions of loss, paradoxically, created space for innovation and creativity. Would the Renaissance have emerged without the Black Death? Perhaps, but many historians believe the plague was a crucial accelerant. Yet, the story doesn't end there. For as much as the Black Death changed Europe, it did not vanish after the 1350s. It returned. Again and again for centuries, plague outbreaks flared. London, for instance, suffered repeated plagues, with one of the worst in 1665, killing a fifth of the city's population. Each new outbreak reminded people of the horror of the 14th century and kept fear alive in Europe's cultural memory. And here's something else that might surprise you. The Black Death reshaped global history, not just Europe's. Remember, it began in Asia. China lost millions, weakening the Yuan dynasty and contributing to its eventual collapse. The Mongol Empire, already fragmented, was devastated by the plague, which helped end their dominance over Eurasia. The Middle East, too, suffered terribly. Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad lost vast portions of their populations. The great Islamic empires survived, but their societies were scarred. In many ways, the Black Death was the first truly global pandemic. It united humanity in suffering across continents, long before airplanes or the internet. But what about medicine? Did people learn anything from the horror? The truth is complicated. Medieval doctors had no concept of bacteria or germs. They blamed bad air, planetary alignments, or divine punishment. Yet the sheer scale of the crisis forced changes. Quarantine, pioneered in Italian city-states like Venice, became a permanent part of public health. Cities developed new systems for monitoring disease. Slowly, painfully, the idea that human action could prevent or control outbreaks took root. It would take centuries more before germ theory revolutionized medicine, but the seeds were planted during the Black Death. Perhaps the most haunting legacy, though, is psychological. Imagine living through a time when every knock on the door could bring news of another death. Imagine burying children, parents, friends, and never knowing if tomorrow would be your turn. Survivors of the Black Death carried trauma we can scarcely comprehend. And yet from that trauma, they built anew. They reshaped economies, questioned authority, and created art that still speaks to us today. In their suffering, they forged resilience. And here's where the story circles back to us, because the Black Death is not just history, it's a mirror. In our modern world, we too have faced pandemics. We too have seen how disease can shake economies, expose inequalities, and test faith in institutions. The Black Death reminds us that pandemics are not just medical events. They are social, cultural, and political earthquakes. They leave scars that last for centuries. So let's return to that haunting question. How could a disease that erased 1/3 of Europe also transform it? The answer is that destruction and creation are often intertwined. The Black Death broke the medieval world, but in breaking it, it made space for something new. Feudalism weakened. Faith was questioned. Art deepened. Science edged forward. And, slowly, painfully, Europe began its journey toward the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. By the time the last great plague outbreak faded from Europe, the world was no longer medieval. It had been reborn, scarred, but transformed. The Black Death was not just a tragedy. It was a turning point in human history. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of all. Out of unimaginable suffering can come change. Out of darkness can come light. The people of the 14th century could not see it then, but their nightmare became the foundation of our modern world. The Black Death was a terror. It was a destroyer. But it was also, in its grim way, a creator.